A square of sun-brittled paper trembled on a jacket that had given up its color to the canyon. The ink had faded to a tired gray, but 4 words still held like the desert itself, a message fastened to the chest with a rusted safety pin whispering that we quit before the canyon did. Let me know where you're listening from and share this if you believe remembering is the first step toward justice. Before everything unraveled, my days moved with a rhythm you could set a wristwatch to. I'd wake before dawn on the west side of Salt Lake City, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon porch air hovering around 40 degrees, and the Wasatch Peaks just beginning to take on a pale, forgiving light. I'd drive my 15-year-old county truck south toward Devil's Ridge with the heater on low and a thermos wedged against the map case, the road empty except for a couple of delivery vans and the occasional lone sedan with ski racks and a cracked windshield. The canyons stay red all year, but in early spring they drink the sunlight differently, cooler, thinner, like a tune played on a steel string instead of a warm acoustic. Devil's Ridge is a maze that punishes pride. Every season it beckons folks from the city who want quiet and color, and every season it keeps 1 or 2 reminders from those who don't respect the angles. When I wore the uniform every day, my job was never to scare anyone off the trail. My job was to prepare them to treat the place like a living thing. I ran orientations, checked permits, tuned radios, and when it came to it, stepped into the sandstone with a pack and a plan. On ordinary weeks, I spent more time showing people how to loop a bear hang or read a cairn than anything else. On ordinary weeks, the phone on my belt didn't ring much past dinner. That month, early March, the ridge looked forgiving. Daytime highs crept into the mid-50s, nights in the high 20s, a dry cold that sharpened sound. You could hear gravel tip from a boot sole 30 feet away. Cottonwoods along the wash showed a faint green haze, and the trailhead bulletin board held the season's first cluster of handwritten notes. Headed to West Spur, back Sunday, 2-night loop, see you Monday. Little promises people make to strangers because it makes everyone feel less alone out there. I'd pin fresh weather printouts and tighten the thumbtacks like that could keep anyone safe. That's how I first started recognizing Rebecca, not as a headline or a case number, but as a steady presence on the quiet edge of the morning. She stood out because she didn't waste words. When she came through the ranger station to update a permit or borrow a map sleeve, she'd listen all the way through, ask 1 or 2 precise questions, and then tuck everything away with care folds, sharp pen-capped radio test done by the book. 5 feet 7 boots broken into the shape of her life, and the kind of focus you see in trail runners timing their breath against the rise. She worked a desk job in town and didn't bother to hide it. Her hands were office clean, but carried the small scars you get from snagged branches and stove burns. She once told me in that easy, practical tone of hers that hiking alone was the only time she felt like her thoughts lined up and stayed where she put them. Her sister Maria arrived in this story the way sisters do, by care and by habit. Their voices were different, but you could hear the same velocity underneath. Maria lived 2 streets over from me, a rental with a narrow front walk and wind chimes that clinked like glass buttons. I'd see her some evenings in a hoodie and work flats walking a dog that didn't quite understand sidewalks, and we'd trade the kind of neighbor talk you forget and then remember right when you need to. She'd bring by extra Tupperware after her church potlucks and ask about trail conditions for whatever adventure her sister had in mind. She wasn't trying to stop Rebecca from going, just trying to keep the world honest. Life that week was a handful of small, good scenes. On Tuesday, I watched a father kneel to retie his daughter's pink laces at the trailhead, her hat tilted crooked, the brim stitching frayed from last summer. On Thursday, a retired couple from St. George returned a borrowed guidebook with a thank you card and $2 taped inside for coffee. On Friday, I swapped out a dead AA battery in a radio and listened as the static gave way to a clean test 3 beeps, a clear tone, and a voice. Copy Channel 2. The ordinary can be so convincing, you forget to look at the edges. I remember a Saturday morning at the cafe on State Street where the pancakes come on plates that weigh more than a good tent steak. The doorbell jangled, cold air followed, and there was Rebecca with that easy, contained smile. She slid into a booth across from Maria. I don't eavesdrop as a hobby, but in a town like ours, the stories pass close enough to touch a grocery list recited from memory. A joke about a heater that woke up only when it felt like it, a promise to be home by Monday night because work expected her at 9 sharp Tuesday. They split the bill like it was habit and hugged in the doorway where the sunlight falls low and patient across the tile. I remember thinking these are the things you anchor to the small, repeatable proofs of normal. Out on Devil's Ridge, the trail doesn't announce its trouble. It just accepts you on your terms and waits to find out if those terms are honest. The first mile is all invitation compact soil, shallow-grade juniper perfuming the air. The second mile starts to turn you around among fins of stone that look the same from too many angles. The third mile hides the water you need unless you already know where it runs. Thin trickles under shade that still holds frost. I've walked those miles in July when heat comes off the rock like a stove door opening, and in December when the shadows turn the color of bruised plums. Early spring keeps its secrets in the wind. You can sense company when the breeze hits your back and then pulls away and everything quiets in a way that makes boot prints seem louder than they should. On my end, routine kept its grip. I checked weather again. Gusts predicted nothing dramatic. I remarked a caution sign where winter had loosened a post. I logged 3 permit updates and a reminder that we'd had 2 rescues last season because folks chased a shortcut that wasn't there. Back at my desk, the old wall clock ticked with a click you could feel in your teeth, and the ring-bound incident log sat open to a page I never thought would matter. I wrote in 2 neat lines, early spring conditions. Trails in good shape. Advise extra water due to dry air. In a job like mine, you trust that good habits buy you time. I ran into Detective Cassidy Vega late that afternoon in line at Ray's Hardware, both of us holding camp stove fuel and a box of drywall anchors. Cassidy worked outside the park, but out here jurisdiction swirls like dust. We bump into each other more than we plan. She asked if the ridge was seeing early traffic. I said yes a little and told her we'd done our pre-season radio checks. She nodded that calm she carries like a tool. We talked about a missing skier she closed out in January, a body recovered, a family grateful and grieving. Some jobs ask you to live in the space between relief and regret, and she knows that landscape better than most. We parted in the parking lot with a wave and a promise to trade intel if anything odd crossed our desks. It was an ordinary exchange, and the ordinariness was a comfort. That evening, I grilled chicken on my narrow porch and watched the color leave the day. A neighbor's porch light snapped on across the street. The bulb hummed faintly, one of those inexpensive ones that pretend to be warm. The air dried out the way Utah air does after sunset, the temperature dropping 15 degrees in an hour, like someone had cracked a window to winter. I flipped the radio to scan and let the chatter roll weather station a couple of trail tests, the county channel reminding folks to set clocks forward next weekend. I turned the volume down and folded maps for the next morning. Sunday came and went with the small business of the world families at the trailhead with sunscreen stripes on noses. Someone asking where the mile markers begin. Me pointing out the loop from a laminated map that had been wiped down so many times. The blue water lines looked like they'd been drawn with a shaking hand. A boy around 10 asked me if coyotes could read the no dogs off leash sign and laughed at his own joke. I laughed too because he earned it. Around 3, a gust bent the tops of the junipers and spilled dust against the lot in a low tan sheet. I watched it pass and felt that old contentment, the kind that makes you believe dangerously that today will end as clean as it began. Monday, the office at the ranger station warmed slowly, the heater clicking, then committing. Paperwork stacked up the way it does when spring returns. Requests, reminders, route notes left for friends. I signed off on a maintenance ticket for a loose board on a footbridge and relabeled a box of spare batteries with a thicker marker because the last one had faded to a polite whisper. At lunch, I ate a sandwich over my map drawer and circled a wash that tends to surprise folks after wind. Around me, radios and printers and that old wall clock kept time like a trio that had rehearsed together for years. By late afternoon, I was where I always am, making sure the trailhead kiosk told the truth and the sign-in sheets were squared so the names read straight. Toward evening, the city drew its lights on. I turned my truck toward home, cut through a neighborhood where kids bounced a basketball under a half-lit street lamp, and pulled into my driveway as the first real chill touched my hands. I dropped my pack just inside the door and set my phone on the counter where it always charges a habit muscle nose without help. The house settled around me, a clock above the sink, the refrigerator motor starting its low, practical rumble, the faint static of a radio I'd forgotten to turn down. Somewhere across town, a porch light burned a little longer than usual. In the canyon, the wind had gone lean and restless, pushing across the rock with a dry hiss. At my place, I stood with the curtain open and watched for a set of headlights I'd expected to see by now, steady beams easing into a familiar driveway, a simple signal that the day had closed the way it should. The street stayed empty. The phone stayed quiet. And the night patient and sure of itself drew a little closer to the glass. By 10, the neighborhood had gone to sleep, but one porch across town kept its light on its halo thin and stubborn, holding the dark at arm's length. I told myself there was no reason to call. Then, as the hour hand slipped past 11, I reached for the phone and hesitated, listening to the small house sounds, the clock, the fridge, the radio, each one a reminder that everything was normal until it wasn't. That night stretched longer than most. The air turned still, the kind of still that presses against a window pane and makes you aware of every sound inside your own house. I'd left my radio on low, that faint background hum of chatter between rangers and weather updates. Somewhere between one conversation and the next, I realized I hadn't heard Rebecca check in. Normally, she would have called in by dusk, just a quick transmission to confirm her position, maybe mention a water source or wind shift. Nothing dramatic, just a habit. But Monday night passed without a word. By Tuesday morning, I told myself she was probably fine. Hikers stretch an extra night all the time when the stars behave and the wind stays polite. Still, I called the ranger station just after 7. A young dispatcher answered one I'd trained years back. He said they hadn't heard from her either, but not to jump to conclusions. She's experienced, he reminded me. Could be out of range. I hung up, poured another cup of coffee, and tried to let that logic sit. It didn't. The coffee went cold before I remembered to drink it. Around noon, I drove out toward the trailhead anyway. The parking lot was quiet except for one rental sedan with a thin layer of red dust on its windshield. Her car. I brushed my hand over the hood, still cool. She'd been gone longer than the engine's warmth could hold. The permit slip was still on the dash, dated 4 days earlier, her handwriting neat as always. I stood there, engine idling behind me, and told myself I'd wait until evening before reporting it. But that gnawing unease had already decided for me. By late afternoon, we'd organized the first pass. 2 rangers, 1 volunteer team, and myself heading down the main ridge. The canyon carried sound in strange ways. Every gust echoed like footsteps until you learned to separate the echoes from the living. We reached her last known campsite just as the sun was lowering behind the rock spires. The tent still stood, but half collapsed, one pole snapped. Her sleeping bag had spilled halfway out like someone had crawled free in a hurry. I remember kneeling my knees, pressing into sand, still warm from the day. Her pack was there, open, the contents scattered a first aid kit. Protein bars, extra socks rolled tight. Everything an experienced hiker keeps close. But her radio, her knife, and her water bottles were gone. When I pressed the power button on her emergency beacon, nothing happened. Batteries drained or maybe removed. I called it in. The lead ranger on duty, a quiet man named Hal, arrived 20 minutes later and studied the site with the kind of expression you only see in people who've walked into too many scenes like this. We marked coordinates, took photographs, and set up a perimeter. It was routine, but none of it felt routine. That night, the search began in earnest. Helicopters traced slow loops over the ridges, their spotlights sweeping the ground like patient hands searching for a pulse. Dogs were brought in from a neighboring county, noses low to the ground, tails tight with focus. I stayed by the command tent, listening to radio chatter blur between optimism and fatigue. The first set of boot prints matched her tread size pattern, everything right? But the tracks led deeper into the maze of canyons, not toward the trailhead as you'd expect from someone in trouble. I followed those prints myself the next morning. They pressed straight into narrow passageways where the walls closed in to shoulder width, the sand packed hard. Every few feet I'd glance up expecting to catch a glimpse of fabric or movement. But the prints just stopped. Not faded into stone, not blown away. They stopped mid-stride like the rest of her had been lifted out of the earth. When we radioed the station to report the finding, silence followed. Then Hal's voice, measured but hollow. "Copy that. Mark location. Return to base." That was all. He didn't need to say more. Every searcher out there knew what that usually meant. Over the next 3 weeks, the operation grew into something larger than our small department could handle. Volunteers came from towns I hadn't even heard of. The National Guard lent helicopters. Locals cooked meals for crews who barely paused long enough to eat them. But nothing turned up, no gear, no clothing, no trace beyond that last footprint. The desert swallowed sound time and certainty all at once. Maria showed up at the command tent every morning. She refused to sit, refused to leave. I'd find her at the edge of the perimeter holding a thermos she never drank from. One afternoon I walked over and told her we were expanding the grid another 2 miles. She nodded, eyes red from the wind, and asked if we'd checked the ravines past West Spur. I said we had twice. She thanked me anyway and kept watching the horizon. By the end of the second month, the official search scaled down. The paperwork used words like suspended and pending new evidence. To families, those words mean one thing: you're on your own. I stayed on a few days longer than required, running unofficial sweeps with a pair of volunteers. But there's only so long you can comb an ocean of stone before it all starts looking the same. When the final team packed up, I watched the last helicopter rise into the afternoon glare until it shrank to a silver pin against the sky. The sound faded, leaving only wind. Maria didn't give up. I'd see her at gear shops leaving flyers with Rebecca's picture and a phone number written in careful blue ink. She even came by my place once that fall holding a box of her sister's things she couldn't bring herself to unpack. We sat on my porch under the porch light that hums like a tired bee, the one I always forget to replace. She told me she still heard Rebecca's laugh when she passed certain coffee shops or saw a woman in a faded sweatshirt. She asked if I thought it was possible her sister had just walked away. I didn't have the heart to answer that. After that, the years started to slide. Other cases came lost, climbers' wrong turns, heat exhaustion. I retired in 2015, handed in my badge, and tried to convince myself that closure was something you could make peace with even if you never found it. Then, in April 2016, the phone rang. I was on my back porch, sanding down an old chair when the county number appeared on the screen. It was Detective Vega. Her voice had that same steady current, but there was something under it I hadn't heard before. Wait. She said 2 hikers had stumbled on remains out near the lower ravine 3 miles from Rebecca's last campsite. I drove out that afternoon not as an officer anymore, just as someone who needed to be there. The road wound through sandstone cliffs that looked the same as they had 5 years earlier, though maybe they felt meaner now. At the site, deputies moved carefully around a taped-off area at the base of 2 large rock slabs. The air was sharp with decay and iron. I stood at the ridge and looked down. The desert had been merciless, but not complete sun-bleached bone scraps of fabric and that brittle piece of paper fixed to her jacket. The note was still legible even after 5 years of wind and rain. 4 words written in thick black ink pinned straight over her chest. I didn't read them aloud. I just stared at the rusted safety pin, the deliberate press of it through cloth that had once kept her warm. Detective Vega stepped beside me, eyes scanning the scene. She didn't say much, didn't need to. We both understood that this wasn't a hiker lost to weather or chance. This was staged. A message left by someone who'd been watching all along. The silence around us deepened as if even the canyon understood the gravity of it. When the coroner's team arrived, I backed away and let them work. They zipped the remains into a bag with the kind of reverence you only learn from years of doing it. I watched them carry her up the ravine, the line of deputies guiding the stretcher over uneven ground. Sunlight caught the edge of the bag for a second, turning it pale gold. Then it passed, and the color was gone. That night I couldn't sleep. The words from that note played in my head like a looped transmission. They weren't the words of a desperate woman. They were a taunt. Whoever had done this wanted us to know we'd been played. I went out to the porch, sat under the humming light, and felt the old instinct stir the need to understand, to trace patterns in the dust until something gave way. By morning, Vega called again. The autopsy confirmed what we already suspected: blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, immediate, deliberate. Murder. No sign of a fall. She said the paper from the note had faint markings near the edges, symbols so small they looked like scratches at first. Coordinates, maybe. I told her about old trail markers guides used before GPS hand-coded symbols that mapped water sources and danger zones. She said she'd bring in a specialist to take a closer look. For the first time in 5 years, there was movement and investigation that might finally have direction. But with it came something darker. The idea that someone had orchestrated this from within our own circle, someone who knew those canyons as intimately as we did. That evening, as the sun bled out over the ridge and shadows stretched across the empty parking lot, I walked to Rebecca's old car, where it still sat in storage dust, layered thick as felt. I pressed my hand against the hood again, same place as the first day, and whispered what I should have said back then, that we hadn't stopped looking. Not really. Behind me, the canyon exhaled a dry wind rolling through juniper and stone. Somewhere beyond those walls, the person who left that note had walked freely for 5 years, maybe passing the same trailheads, maybe even stopping at the same diner on State Street where Rebecca once laughed with her sister. Detective Vega's headlights appeared down the road, growing brighter as she pulled in. She stepped out, holding a folder under one arm. "We got something," she said. "You might want to see this." I didn't ask what it was written all over her face. The coordinates from the note pointed to a spot deeper in the ridge somewhere off the old ranger maps, a place that hadn't been used since the early 90s. As she unfolded the topo print, the evening light caught on her badge and flared for a second like a warning. I remember the feeling that crept over me then, not fear exactly, but a cold recognition. Whoever had done this wasn't just hiding in the wilderness. He'd built a home in it, and for the first time since Rebecca vanished, I felt the weight of the desert shift, not as emptiness, but as something alive, something that had been watching us all along. The coordinates Vega showed me that night pointed to a hollow deep inside Devil's Ridge, farther than any ranger route had been charted in years. The next morning we hiked in with a small team, 2 deputies, a crime scene tech, and a local guide who knew the old trails better than GPS ever could. The air out there felt thinner, colder, even though the sun was burning high. Every sound carried for miles: boots on rock, the brush of jackets, a loose strap knocking against a canteen. You start to realize how the wilderness listens when you're looking for something that doesn't want to be found. We followed the old map until the trail turned to rubble, and the guide said this was as far as it went. Vega unfolded the printout again, checking the coordinates against the rock formations. Then she pointed toward a narrow split between 2 canyon walls, just a crack of shadow. "There," she said quietly. "That's where it wants us to go." The passage was no wider than my shoulders. We had to move sideways through parts of it, using headlamps to light the sandstone as the daylight vanished behind us. The air changed inside, stale, almost damp. The canyon opened suddenly into a small basin, maybe 40 yards across. In the center stood a structure I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. The remains of an old ranger outpost, one of the stations abandoned in the early 90s when budget cuts closed half the park. The wood was bleached white from sun and time windows gone, roof slumped but still holding. It shouldn't have been standing at all. Yet someone had kept it alive. There were fresh footprints in the dust and a generator half buried under a tarp along the wall. Vega lifted the tarp. The machine was clean, recently serviced. That smell of oil and rust hit me hard, the kind that only builds when something's been running in secret. Inside, we found more. Camping gear, canned food stacked by expiration date, a makeshift bedroll tucked into one corner. And in the back room, what used to be a gear locker, we found a metal trunk. The lock was heavy new. Vega knelt, ran her fingers along the hinge, and nodded for the tech to cut it. The latch gave with a short metallic crack. When she lifted the lid, none of us spoke. Inside lay a row of cassette tapes, each labeled in neat handwriting with dates from 2011. Beneath them, a stack of leather-bound journals wrapped with cord. Vega took one tape, slipped it into a handheld player the tech had brought, and pressed play. The sound came out thin, distant, but the voice that followed was sharp enough to pierce through any static. Male calm with the easy rhythm of someone narrating a trip. March 19th day, one of the Rebecca Project, it began. She doesn't know I'm following her. She's good. Better than most, efficient, confident. The voice stopped there for a second, almost like he was smiling before he spoke again. She trusts the markers. Doesn't realize I replaced them 2 days ago. The room went so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Vega froze with the player in her hand, her knuckles white. When she hit stop, the silence in that room turned heavier than any noise could have been. We all understood what we were listening to. Someone had stalked Rebecca through those canyons. Someone who'd studied her habits, who knew how to manipulate her trust in the terrain itself. Vega slid the tape back and picked up another. This one was dated the 20th. She pressed play. She's starting to realize something's wrong, the voice said. Radioed the ranger station. Said someone's following her. Smart girl, but not smart enough. She still doesn't understand that I'm not following. I'm leading. Then laughter, quiet, self-satisfied, the kind that lingers in your head long after it's gone. Vega stopped the tape again. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she said, "He's documenting it like it's a field experiment." She set the player down carefully, like it might break under the weight of what we just heard. We stayed in that room until sundown, collecting every piece of evidence we could find. The journals were worse than the tape's pages of observations about hikers, mostly women, written in tidy, detached sentences. Notes about their endurance thresholds, predictable responses, even ratings next to their names. It read like someone cataloging wildlife, not people. Back at the sheriff's office, Vega started running the name we'd found on an old business card tucked into one of the journals, Garrett Boone. The card read, Canyon Soul Expeditions Wilderness Training and Survival Courses. The company name rang a faint bell. I remembered seeing a flyer once at the ranger station years earlier. Weekend courses, backcountry navigation, survival theory. It had looked legitimate. Records showed the business shut down abruptly in 2011, right after Rebecca vanished. Garrett Boone had been 41 at the time, former wilderness guide. No criminal record, no complaints. He'd just disappeared from the professional world like he'd walked into the desert and never turned back. Vega found a few old reviews online, people praising his patience, his methodical teaching. It was always that word, methodical. Over the next few days, she pulled phone logs from Rebecca's case file. Buried among old data there, it was 6 calls to a number registered to Canyon Soul Expeditions. The last one made 2 days before she left for her final hike. I sat in Vega's office while she called Maria to confirm whether Rebecca had ever mentioned hiring a guide. Maria paused a long time before answering. Then she said, she took a navigation class, just a weekend thing. Said the instructor really understood her. Made her feel like she wasn't strange for wanting to be alone out there. Vega thanked her, hung up, and stared at the computer screen. He didn't pick her by chance, she said. He groomed her. We drove to Boone's last known address the next morning. A cabin on county land 40 minutes off the highway, half swallowed by juniper and dust. The place looked deserted. No car, no footprints, but the door wasn't locked. Vega called for backup anyway, then pushed it open. The smell hit us first, stale air mixed with faint wood smoke, maybe weeks old. The main room was cluttered with camping gear under sheets, but the back door had been reinforced with new hinges and an external lock hung twisted from a recent break. Vega forced it open, and what we saw inside has stayed with me ever since. Every wall was covered with photographs. Women all ages, all smiling in outdoor gear, clients maybe, each face circled in red marker. Underneath every photo, handwritten notes, too soft. Gave up early. Not ready. But in the center of the wall, like a trophy, one photograph had different words scrawled beneath it. Lesson 1, perfect. It was Rebecca standing against a backdrop of canyon light, smiling at whoever held the camera. Vega stepped closer, her jaw tight. He documented everything she said, quietly. Selection testing outcome. We spent the next 3 hours cataloging evidence maps, more tapes, clothing tags, scraps of receipts. It was clear Boone hadn't just killed Rebecca. He'd been running his own ritual of control, studying his victims like puzzles. In one of the journals, he'd written about the illusion of safety and how control is proof of existence. I remember reading that line twice. It was the kind of logic that only makes sense to someone completely detached from humanity. By the time we left the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the ridge. Vega stood by her car, staring down the dirt road that vanished into the canyon. He's out here somewhere, she said. He knows these trails better than anyone. I could hear the frustration behind her calm tone. The wilderness had always been her enemy in these cases. It could hide anything, even a man like this. Back at headquarters, the lab confirmed what we'd already guessed. The symbols on Rebecca's note matched the old trail markers used by guides in the 70s and 80s. Each guide had their own signature, a system of shapes carved or drawn to mark safe routes or hidden water. The ones on her note matched perfectly to the markings found on Boone's old signage from his business. It was his calling card. The press caught wind of the discovery within days. Rebecca's photo appeared on every evening broadcast, her name finally paired with a suspect. For Maria, it brought a strange kind of relief and renewed pain all at once. She came by the station with coffee for the team, said she just wanted to thank Vega for not giving up. I saw her glance at the evidence board before she left, eyes landing on that single photograph of her sister, and I knew she'd seen the word beneath it. Perfect. She didn't say anything, but I watched her shoulders tighten before she walked out into the hallway light. That night, Vega sat in her office replaying one of the later tapes. I stopped in the doorway as Garrett Boone's voice filled the room again, this time more excited, almost breathless. She fought, he said. Didn't expect that. Most of them freeze, but she ran. Swung at me, too. Brave. But you can't outrun someone who knows every inch of the canyon. The tape ended there with a rush of wind and Boone's steady breathing. Vega pressed stop and looked up at me. He wanted her to fight, she said. He wanted to prove he could break her. Then she shut the player off and rubbed her temples. We're dealing with someone who plans years ahead. He's patient, careful. He won't stop until he's caught or until he decides he's done. Outside, the night had settled cold over the desert, the stars sharp and still. I drove home with the tape's echo still crawling through my head. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a murder investigation. It was a map of one man's obsession with control, and we were only beginning to see how wide that map stretched. When I got home, I stood on the porch for a long time watching the horizon. The ridge sat black against the sky, unmoving, endless. Somewhere out there, Garrett Boone was breathing the same dry air, walking the same trails we'd walked all day. And I knew deep down that finding him wouldn't be like tracking a lost hiker. He wasn't lost. He was waiting. The night before we moved in on him, the desert was too still. No wind, no sound, no movement beyond the hum of Vega's engine as we sat parked outside the ranger station, going over what little we had. The coordinates from that last tape led to another stretch of canyon country, 6 miles north of where Rebecca's remains had been found, remote enough that you could fire a rifle out there and no one would hear it. For weeks, Boone had stayed a ghost. Every lead fizzled before we reached it. Every tip came a day too late. But then, 3 days prior, a ranger from southern Utah radioed in about a campsite freshly abandoned gear still warm from the sun. And inside that tent was a woman's driver's license. Not Rebecca's. A new name. A new face. A woman who'd gone missing just 2 weeks earlier. Vega didn't say it outright, but we both knew what that meant. He was hunting again, and this time he hadn't finished. The urgency in the room was like static. She gathered the team, 4 of us total, and laid out the plan. No heroics, no chasing shadows. Find the site, confirm his presence, bring the woman home alive. Simple in theory, never simple in the field. We hit the trail before dawn. The sky was still ink black, the stars so sharp they looked carved into it. I could feel the weight of the coming day pressing in the heat, the distance, the waiting. The truck rattled over washboard dirt until we couldn't drive any farther, and from there it was on foot. The terrain was rough, scattered with loose shale that cracked under our boots. Every sound carried far. Vega took point, moving quiet and measured. I stayed behind her, scanning the ridgelines, half expecting to catch a flicker of movement against the horizon. After 3 hours, we reached the canyon system marked on the map. The entrance was narrow and steep, a throat of stone that swallowed our voices whole. We descended single file. The air cooled immediately, thick with the smell of dust and creosote. Somewhere ahead, a raven called once, then went silent. That's when we heard it, a faint murmur that didn't belong to the wind. Human voices. Vega motioned for us to stop. We crouched low behind a cluster of boulders, listening. One voice was male, slow and calm, the other softer, high with tension. She nodded to me, then to the deputies. We moved along the rock wall, keeping to the shadows until the clearing opened below us. There he was. Garrett Boone. Same face from the old photographs, older. Now beard streaked gray, but unmistakable. He was crouched by a small fire talking to a woman who sat a few feet away, hands zip-tied in front of her. Her face was streaked with dirt, eyes wide and unblinking. He looked comfortable, like this was all routine. Vega signaled the deputies to fan out. She waited for one of them to confirm the line of sight, then stood, weapon drawn, her voice steady. "Garrett Boone. Police. Don't move." For a moment, he didn't. He looked up from the fire, then at us, and smiled a slow, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. He lifted his hands in mock surrender, the firelight flickering across his face. "Detective Vega," he said, like greeting an old acquaintance. "Took you long enough." "On your knees," she ordered. He obeyed, still smiling, his gaze drifting past us to the woman. One of the deputies rushed forward, cut her restraints, and pulled her back to safety. She broke down as soon as she was clear hands, shaking breath, hitching, but alive. I remember the sound she made when she realized we weren't part of Boone's twisted game. It was half sob, half relief, and it hit me harder than I expected. Vega kept her gun on him as she closed the distance. "You're done, Garrett," she said. His tone stayed calm, almost conversational. "You think catching me is the end of this? Rebecca's still dead. The others are still gone. You've been dancing to my tune for years." Vega didn't react. She stepped behind him, cuffed his wrists, and read him his rights. He didn't resist, didn't even blink. Just that same grin, faint and self-satisfied. We got him back to the truck just as the first real heat of day rolled in. The woman, her name was Claire, sat in the back seat wrapped in a blanket, silent, except for the occasional whisper of thank you. She'd been missing 16 days. 16. I kept thinking about that number as we drove out, that if the ranger hadn't stumbled on that campsite when he did, we might have been too late again. Back at the station, the arrest made the news within hours. The words serial predator started appearing in headlines, and reporters gathered outside the sheriff's office like vultures waiting for the next scrap of detail. But inside, the mood wasn't victory. It was exhaustion. Vega sat at her desk, mud still caked on her boots, staring at the file in front of her. Boone's confession tapes and journals filled an entire evidence cabinet. For the next several days, the FBI helped sift through every page. Each one was worse than the last notes about testing limits, breaking resistance, proving control. He'd tracked at least 5 women across state lines, all hikers, all fitting the same pattern. Rebecca wasn't his first, but she was the one who made him feel invincible. During interrogation, Boone never raised his voice. He answered every question like he was lecturing a classroom, leaning forward just enough to make it personal. "You don't get it," he told Vega once. "This wasn't about killing. It was about truth. People like her think they're safe because they know the land. But nature doesn't care about their confidence. I just helped her see that." Vega didn't take the bait. She let him talk until the smugness wore thin, then pushed a photo of Rebecca across the table. "You didn't teach her anything she said. You murdered her." For the first time, his expression shifted. Not guilt, something closer to irritation. "She fought," he said quietly. "That's why she mattered." He leaned back and closed his eyes as if savoring the memory. I had to step out of the room. Over the next few weeks, the pieces came together. The recordings, the journals, the matching trail markers from the note pinned to Rebecca's chest, every detail formed a perfect, terrible pattern. Boone had manipulated his clients into trusting him, studied their habits, then lured them into isolation under the guise of teaching advanced navigation. When he spoke on the tapes, he called each victim a lesson. Rebecca was the one he considered flawless. Maria attended the preliminary hearings, quiet but steady. I remember her standing in the back of the courtroom, hands clasped, eyes fixed on Boone as they read the charges. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. When the session adjourned, she turned to Vega and whispered, "He doesn't get the last word." Vega nodded, and that became our unspoken mission from then on to make sure he didn't. The trial began 8 months later. The prosecution laid out the evidence like a roadmap through years of cruelty. The tapes, the photos, the journals, Claire's testimony. Boone sat through it all unflinching like he was above it. His defense tried to argue diminished capacity, hinted at a broken childhood, but none of it held. When the tapes played for the jury, the sound of him stalking Rebecca, laughing, as he described teaching her, you could feel the temperature in the room drop. By the time the verdict came down, guilty on every count, there wasn't a soul in that courtroom who doubted what kind of man he was. The sentencing hearing was quiet, almost anticlimactic. Life without parole. Multiple consecutive terms. Vega exhaled for the first time in months. Boone was escorted out without looking back, still wearing that faint, infuriating smirk. Maria sat down slowly, her hands trembling in her lap. "She fought," Vega told her softly, "right to the end." Maria nodded, tears finally breaking through. "Then she won," she said. After the trial, the canyon felt different. I went back once, weeks later, not for evidence, just to stand where it had all started. The air was hot, the rock walls glowing in the late light. I could still see the faint outline of old boot prints in the dust, hers, his, ours. I thought about how many people had walked through here before never knowing what those canyons had kept hidden. and for the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe the silence wasn't just emptiness. Maybe it was her peace settling back into the place she loved. We never did find all of his victims, though the FBI kept searching. Some of their names came from his notebooks, some from missing persons files that finally made sense. But Rebecca's story, the note, the tapes, the arrest, it was the one that broke the pattern. It exposed the truth that had lived in the shadows for too long. Even now, when the evening news mentions Devil's Ridge, I still picture that stretch of canyon the way it looked the day we found her. The sun climbing over the rim, wind moving through dry grass, the world briefly holding its breath before the sound of rotors returned it to motion. The desert keeps its secrets, but it doesn't forgive the ones who mistake silence for safety. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I replay Boone's last words from the interrogation room. "You think finding me means you won," he said. "But you only found what I wanted you to find." He believed that. He believed his control extended beyond death, beyond justice. But standing there in the courtroom, watching him led away in chains, I realized how wrong he was. He'd built his life on the illusion of dominance, and Rebecca shattered it with one act of defiance she fought. That truth is what stayed. Not his name, not his games. Hers. And even now, years later, I can still feel it every time I look toward those ridges at sunset, the quiet kind of strength that refuses to die, the echo of someone who never let him win. Still, some nights I wonder if he left anything else behind. Another cache, another message buried out there in that endless red stone. The thought settles and drifts unresolved like wind moving through canyon walls. And maybe that's what keeps me looking west whenever the air grows dry and the light turns amber, half expecting to see a shadow where there shouldn't be one. Because stories like his never really end. They just wait for the next time someone stops listening too soon. The morning after Boone was sentenced, the courthouse was quieter than I'd ever heard it. The crowd was gone, reporters packing up their tripods, the hallway echoing with nothing but the sound of rubber soles and closing doors. Vega stood by the window, sunlight catching the edge of her badge, and said softly, "It's over." But it didn't sound like relief, more like the end of a storm that had already changed the shape of the land. I remember stepping outside into the late autumn air. The wind was sharp, but it carried that kind of stillness that follows a long fight, the silence of something finally settled. Boone never spoke again after sentencing. No appeals, no letters, nothing. Last I heard, he spends most days alone in his cell, doesn't interact with anyone. The man who once believed he could control every living thing now has his world measured in square feet and seconds between meals. There's a strange symmetry in that. The wilderness he once twisted into a weapon, replaced by 4 gray walls that will outlast him. Vega told me later that even the prison staff said he just sits there counting seams in the concrete, as if he's still looking for a way out that doesn't exist. Maria didn't stay for the media afterward. She left through the side door, a small bouquet of mountain wildflowers in her hands. She said she wanted to visit her sister's grave before the light faded. I offered to drive her, but she shook her head, smiled that tired kind of smile people wear when the world has asked too much of them already, and said she needed to go alone. A few days later, she started the foundation she'd been talking about, a safety network for hikers and families of the missing. She called it the Hail Project after Rebecca. It started small, a single website, a hotline, a map of verified trail contacts, but it grew fast. Donations, volunteers, workshops. It's still running now, 13 years later, and every time a search ends with someone found alive. Maria sends Vega a short message. One more made it home. That's her version of victory. Quiet, humble, consistent. As for Vega, she lasted another few years in the department. Cases like that take something out of you that never fully comes back. She told me once over late coffee that the hardest part wasn't the crime itself. It was how ordinary the world looks afterward. People still laugh in grocery aisles, still complain about traffic, still go hiking on weekends. Life insists on moving forward even when you're stuck looking backward. She retired not long after consulting on missing persons cases now and then, helping smaller departments avoid the mistakes we made early on. She keeps one photo on her desk, Rebecca smiling on a ridgeline, sun in her eyes. I think it's there to remind her why the work matters more than the outcome. I went back to the ridge only once after all that. It was late spring, the same time of year Rebecca took her last trip. The trail had changed erosion, a few new markers, a wooden sign warning of unstable ground. But some things hadn't changed at all. The red rock still burned under the sun. The air still tasted like dust and heat, and the silence still had that same impossible depth. I followed the old route for a mile or two before stopping near a bend, where the canyon opens into a shallow basin. For a long time, I just stood there. You could almost convince yourself that the land forgets what it's seen, that the wind and the sand bury everything eventually. But I don't think it does. I think it remembers in its own way, not with words or grief, just presence. The kind that hums beneath your boots and tells you you're standing on something sacred and scarred at the same time. Maria hikes that ridge every year now. Not the place where her sister died, but a safer section farther north, one with open sky and clear paths. She leads a group of families, parents, siblings, children, all of them touched by some form of loss. They start at dawn, carry small packs, move slowly, talk quietly. I've joined them once or twice. There's no ceremony, no speeches. They just walk together until the light shifts and the air cools, then stop to share a meal and say the names of the ones they're walking for. That part always gets me, hearing those names spoken aloud against the vastness of the canyon. It's like proof that remembering itself is an act of defiance, that every step forward carries a little piece of the ones who couldn't take another. When I think about Boone now, it isn't his face I remember. It's the note he left pinned to Rebecca's chest, those 4 words that once felt like a taunt. You stopped looking too soon. I used to think it was just cruelty, his way of reminding us we'd failed her, but over time it's taken on a different meaning. We didn't stop looking. We found the truth, however late, however broken it came. Maybe that's what justice really is, not a clean win, not the sound of a gavel, but the quiet refusal to quit searching, even when hope feels like a thread about to snap. The world didn't turn into something safer after Boone was caught. Evil doesn't disappear just because one man is gone. But people changed. Rangers got better equipment, better training, stronger communication systems. The trails got new emergency markers, clearer maps, updated radio towers. Families learned to check in hikers, learned to travel smart. It doesn't undo what happened, but it makes the next step a little surer, and maybe that's enough. For me, the case never really ended. I still keep a drawer at home filled with old files, photos, trail reports, transcripts. Sometimes I take them out and read through them like someone flipping pages of a book they know by heart. There's a kind of peace in knowing the story has an ending, even if it isn't the one you'd wish for. When I close that drawer, I look over at the window where the evening light cuts across the wall, the same color as the rock out in Devil's Ridge, and I think about how Rebecca saw that light every time she hiked out there. Maybe in those final moments, that's what she focused on. Not the fear, not the man behind her, but the sun on stone, the warmth, the sense of home she found in the wild. People like Boone believe they can erase what they destroy. They think fear and violence will make the world forget. But they don't understand how memory works. It doesn't fade with time. It changes shape. It becomes stories told around kitchen tables, photos framed above desks, names carved into trail signs and memorial stones. It becomes the sound of footsteps in the dust, the rustle of a backpack zipper, the quiet prayers of families who refuse to let go. Memory, in its simplest form, is resistance. A few months ago, I got a letter from Claire, the woman we found alive that day in the canyon. She's doing well now, living up north, teaching classes on trauma recovery and survival. In her letter, she said something that stayed with me. He thought strength was about taking control, she wrote. But real strength is surviving people like him and choosing to live anyway. That line hit me harder than I expected. It's what all of this has been about from the start: survival. Not just the physical kind, but the quiet, daily kind that happens after the worst is over, when you still choose to keep going. Sometimes late at night, I find myself turning the radio dial through static until I land on one of the park frequencies, just to listen. The chatter is mostly routine now: maintenance updates, weather alerts, hikers checking in. Every once in a while I hear a familiar call sign, someone reporting safe return, and I think of Maria's words. One more made it home. There's a comfort in that. Not everything ends in darkness. Some stories, even the tragic ones, bend back toward light if you give them time. I think about Rebecca often, but not in the way I used to. Not as a victim or a headline or even a case number. I think of her as she really was: boots-laced map, folded just right, eyes fixed on the horizon. Someone who sought peace and found danger, but who never stopped fighting to live. That's how I want people to remember her. Not for the way her life ended, but for the strength she carried into it. The desert still keeps its secrets. It still hums at dusk and swallows sound the way it always has. But when I stand there now, listening to the wind slide through the canyons, I swear there's something softer in it. Not forgiveness exactly, but endurance. The land moves on. The people do too. But the truth stays quiet and steady, waiting for whoever comes next to listen. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because the only way to silence the ones who bring harm is to keep remembering the ones who brought light.